Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. As always, the best way you can support the podcast is by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack. You can donate through the website, geopoliticsandempire.com. Do check out all of my affiliates and leave podcast reviews wherever you are listening, whether it's Apple, Spotify, Podbean, Podcast Addict, Castbox. I don't even know all of the players. And yes, we do have ads now on the podcast players. Most of you have been okay with it. I'm trying to tweak them. There have been a few complaints, but honestly, I can't keep carrying on doing geopolitics and empire unless I get financial support. So, either put up with the ads or think about becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack, where you'll get the ad-free version, or just check out some of the video platforms where there's no ads. Joining us for the first time is Bruce Gagnon, coordinator of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. He was co-founder of the Global Network when it was created in 1992. The websites are linked in the description, space4peace.org. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
We chatted a few years back on TNT Radio, and this is your first time on Geopolitics and Empire, and I'm sure there's a lot of people who aren't familiar with your work. I do subscribe to your newsletter. If you could sort of just tell us a bit about your background and the work that you've been doing, Global Network and so forth.
I grew up in a military family, an Air Force family, and I was essentially an ignorant young Republican. Because I went to school on military bases where we were indoctrinated, as you can imagine, in everything about U.S. empire. In 1968, living in the panhandle of Florida, so conservative there, they called it Lower Alabama. I worked on the Richard Nixon campaign when he ran for president. And I did such a good job at 16 years old that when they had a fundraiser for Nixon right before the election, they invited me to sit with one of the speakers, their keynote speaker, actually, Senator Strom Thurmond. I don't know if you know who he was, but he was one of the most racist, reactionary members of the U.S. Senate. And so that's how I got my start in politics. And then in 1971, after graduating high school, I tried to join the Air Force, but I flunked my induction physical because of an old high school football injury. And so I had to get a waiver to get into the military when most people of good sense were trying to stay out. And after my training, I was sent to a base in California that was an airlift base for the war, Travis Air Force Base. GIs would come there from around the country, fly to Vietnam, and when the planes returned, they would bring the body bags of the dead soldiers and the walking wounded. And so there was a lot of anti-war activity outside the base and also, as it turned out, inside the barracks. And my roommate was one of the organizers in the GI resistance movement. And so he would have meetings in our room frequently. At first, I was sitting in a corner, not sure about these people. But then, excuse me, I slowly moved into the circle and my life changed. And I became anti-imperialist really at that time. And then after getting out of the service, going to college, I was recruited by the United Farm Workers Union, Cesar Chavez's union, to become an organizer of fruit pickers in Florida. And then from there, I went into the peace movement in the early 80s, and then worked for the Florida Coalition for Peace and Justice for 15 years, from 1983 to 1998. Began working on space issues at that time, organizing many protests at the Space Center in Florida. And by 1992, we realized that this thing was getting bigger than we could ever imagine. The U.S. was building space warfighting facilities all over the world in various countries. we began making connection with some of those places. And so in 1992, we created the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space in order to essentially create a global constituency, a global understanding about where this whole arms race in space was going, as the US was talking about controlling space and dominating space and denying other countries access to space in a planning document they published in 1997 called Vision for 2020. And at the Space Command headquarters in Colorado, above the doorway, their logo, their slogan, Master of Space, was depicted. So this is where things are at today. And then in the year 2020, just like the Vision 2020 predicted, essentially, Donald Trump and his first administration created the Space Force, the US Space Force, a new branch of the military. And it's interesting because the Space Force said that they were going to be a very lean organization. They weren't going to spend a lot of money. But now they're talking about this Golden Dome, a umbrella essentially over the United States and Canada. Now they're talking about doing it over Europe and moving it into Asia as well, sort of a global, if you will, umbrella to give the US the ability to strike first. And then when any other country, particularly Russia or China, would respond, they would be able to take out the retaliatory strikes. So we're talking about a sword that lunges into the heart of the US enemies, and a shield to protect the US from return strikes. So that's where we are today.
I've got a lot of questions here. You mentioned Space Force, and I believe, on TNT Radio, I interviewed the first Space Force veteran, Matt Laumeier, I think is his name. I haven't had on the podcast yet, but maybe to ask you first, this general topic of what you just discussed, space and its military application. In my studies of geopolitics and international relations, the topic is really neglected. We don't hear much about it. I'm wondering if it's intentional, but when I look at your work of the global network, I think it's one of the most important topics. It's not being discussed because we've had some of the tech oligarchs recently, like Curtis Yarvin, talk about creating some orbital authority where they up in space they put all of their weapons, the satellites, the lasers, everything that manages the weapons down here on Earth, that they would use that basically as their vantage point, like an Elysium, if you will, where we can't reach up there. And that's where they basically hold their monopoly of power. Do you feel that this topic is neglected of space and military?
Absolutely. Even in the so-called peace movement, it's totally, near totally neglected. Let me give you a story just to illustrate. The day I got into this issue actually was June 12th, 1982. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was living in Orlando, Florida, 1 hour from the Space Center. I was watching C-SPAN, the government TV channel, where they cover Congress and the Senate, and when they're not in session, they cover other events. And they were covering the big, huge million-person march in New York City around the UN special session on disarmament. So they were marching against nuclear weapons. So I watched the whole thing, the rally, the speakers, the march. And then when it was over, they switched to a right-wing conference. And the speaker at this conference was Lieutenant General Daniel Graham, Ronald Reagan's head of Star Wars, SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. And in his Q&A, somebody said, General Graham, they say there's almost 1 million people marching in New York today against nuclear weapons. Aren't you worried about that? He said, no, I think it's fantastic because they're out there marching against nuclear weapons and we're moving into space. They don't have a clue. Let them keep doing what they're doing. And it was literally in that moment that I said, holy shit, I've got to start paying attention to this. And I did. And I began taking people in the next year when I went to work for the Florida Coalition for Peace and Justice. repeatedly to the Space Center for protest. So we've been trying all these years to make it a top issue, to bring more people into it. And we've had some success. I mean, we have great affiliate groups all over the world, in South Korea and England and India and in many other countries. And they're really moving on the issue because the U.S. is expanding this space warfare game into these places. So local groups, national groups there are organizing around it. But particularly in the United States, groups have been really slow to come around on it. And it's really sad because it's where the money's going. You know, they're talking about Golden Dome costing anywhere between $550 billion to several $trillion over the next 20 years. Now, the U.S. is today $38 trillion in debt, spending $1 trillion a year just on paying off the debt. And so where is this money going to come from to pay for this Golden Dome? Well, it's going to come out of the social programs, Social Security, healthcare programs, environmental programs, things like that. So this should be a top issue in the United States, and it's not, sadly.
That story you just related about how people have been focused on nuclear weapons and not at all looking above into space. And I was just gonna, it's funny, I was just gonna say, it's like nothing has changed in decades, where people are focused on nukes and hypersonic missiles and tactical nukes. And you know, in the mainstream media, even alternative media, I find very little discussion about space, which is why I wanted to get you on, and I want to continue broaching this topic because, first of all, it's being neglected, and then to get your thoughts on sort of this great game for space. Why is space so important? I mean, you've got obviously the satellites, which coordinate all the other weapons, right, like nukes and everything else, and hypersonics, and then you've got the new laser technology that's being developed, the surveillance apparatuses, Elon Musk's Starlink satellites, and everything else. And so, what is this effectively great game for space, and why are the heavens so important in this regard?
Well, it's a really good question. You know, it's about strategy. I mean, if the peace movement should be looking ahead always, what is the Pentagon, the military industrial complex, what is our strategy for the next period of time? In 1989, I found a congressional study called Military Space Forces, the Next 50 Years. And it really was the opening of my mind to the strategy. You know, they're talking about controlling lower Earth orbit, LEO, because whoever controls the parking lot, and it's becoming increasingly crowded with satellites that are being launched primarily by SpaceX, their Starlink satellites. It's becoming increasingly crowded, keeping Russia and China, the so-called enemies, from having the capability to do what the United States is trying to do, which is see everything, hear everything, and target everything on the planet in any first strike attack, any war of substance. And so that's where the game is going. And also in this study, they talked about the Earth-Moon gravity well. They said, you know, think of a wishing well. Imagine someone is down inside the bottom of a well and you're at the top. Because of gravity, you can control whether that person gets out or not. You're at the top of the well. And they said it's the same thing between the Earth and the Moon. This gravity well between the Earth and the Moon, and there are 2 points on either side of the Moon. If the U.S. controls them with orbiting battle stations, we'll be able to control who gets on and off the Moon. So in the years ahead, when they can go out and mine the sky for precious resources, they say there's helium-3 and water on the Moon. There's magnesium and cobalt and uranium on Mars. There's gold on the asteroids. They want to get out there and mine that stuff. These little rovers driving around Mars today, NASA says they're looking for the origins of life. But in fact, what they're doing is they're doing soil identification, sampling, they're mapping the surface for eventual mining operations. And so this really should tell us where things are going. The United States wants to be able to have the military capability to control this on and off, this gate, essentially on and off the planet Earth. I think one of the reasons for this Golden Dome, frankly, because they know they can never really accomplish the goal of achieving this, impenetrable shield over the planet. The American Physical Society says that to protect from 10 intercontinental ballistic missiles would require 30,000 orbiting interceptors in space, just to control from 10 incoming ICBMs. So they know it's not going to work. I think the real agenda is to pump the aerospace industry with so much money that they're able to then begin to create these other technologies to give the US the capability to control the access on and off the planet Earth. So I think that's the real agenda here. Let me tell you one more story. During the Reagan years, so much money was being pumped into the aerospace industry for Star Wars, they couldn't spend it fast enough. And this was in the days when the American mainstream media still covered some issues like Star Wars. So in the early 80s, they did on one of the major network stations, they did a story about Star Wars, that how they couldn't spend the money fast enough. And they went to one of the new buildings that was built to work on it. And they went inside and the people were sitting around. They didn't have a lot of work to do. They were interviewing some of them. And they came to the conclusion that, there was just massive profits that the aerospace industry had that were not being spent. And what we later learned was they were using those profits to buy up the national television, radio, newspapers. So by now, by today's standard, the military industrial complex owns a lot of the corporate media across the country. And that's why this story doesn't really get covered anymore, because it's not in their interest to do so. So this is really the situation we're in now.
On that last point of them using SDI money to buy media, and the podcast sphere where I work, alternative media, so to speak, independent media, all sorts of theories are posited, and I'm not against going beyond Overton windows, obviously, but there are just some things which flat Earth now has become popular, and given what you're saying, I've looked at podcasts talking about flat Earth. I've met the David Weiss, whatever his name is. I've just seen him talk at a conference in person. I'm just not convinced at all. And I'm wondering, people have posited that they flood the zone with a lot of noise, the CIA and intelligence agencies. And so it's almost as if flat Earth is sort of to detract from what you're talking about. Would that make sense for you?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. They obviously want to distract people, because as they push this Golden Dome and the money that goes with it, there's going to be pushback, and they want to negate that as much as possible. So if they can get people distracted on these side issues, then it's perfect. It works every time.
And going back to what you were saying, I think the documents you were referring to back in, was it 2000, the late 90s? I've read a lot of William Engdahl. I've had him on the podcast probably over half dozen times. I think he's still alive, but very. I don't think he's giving podcast interviews anymore because he's very old. But in his books, he talked about full spectrum dominance. I think that was mentioned in the document you were citing, where the U.S. empire is basically their strategy official is to take total control of the planet. And it says land, sea, space, as you mentioned, inner space, outer space, cyberspace. So is that effectively the official sort of plan of the Pentagon?
Yeah, actually, and those words were first seen by us in that document that I talked about from 1997, Vision for 2020 by the U.S. Space Command. That's where full spectrum dominance was first discussed. And again, in that document, they said that the U.S. will control space, dominate space, and deny other countries access to space. And that matches up with what I was talking about, this Earth-Moon gravity well, because in that 1989 document, a congressional study, in fact, military space forces in the next 50 years, they said that if we controlled this Earth-Moon gravity well, we could control who got on and off the planet. And they said we'd be able to hijack rival shipments upon return. So if anyone else, and they went out and tried to mine the sky, but they weren't authorized, right? You could take them out on the way back because you control this front gate. So they're really taking the idea of a military base into the universe, so to speak. I mean, that's how big their thinking is and how arrogant it is as well.
And to go back to Golden Dome for a second, so on the one hand, can we say you had 1980 Strategic Defense Initiative under Reagan was called Star Wars? It's a side quest, a side note. Then there was HARP as well, right? In the 90s up in Alaska. And then they say other countries have stuff like HARP as well. And then would Golden Dome be sort of Star Wars 2.0? And then what do you make of Trump recently when Carney was at the White House saying Canada would be covered under Golden Dome? And because then you think of Northcom, Northern Command. So the Pentagon has divided, for listeners out there, the world. It's nice how the Pentagon has divided the entire planet under its division: Northern Command, Southern Command, Central Command in the Middle East, AFRICOM, African Command, and Mexico is part of, I believe, Northcom. And so, what would you make of his comments having? I assume they would want to get Mexico as well under the Golden Dome because it's Northcom, and they're also pushing North American integration is the plan as well. And so, just any thoughts on that? And again, you say it's more of a ruse for other agendas?
Well, I think number one, it's so expensive. The United States, again, with $38 trillion in debt, they know they can't pay for it themselves. And in fact, in the Vision for 2020 document from 1997, they talked about we got to get the allies involved in helping to cover these things. So I think that's the real agenda. Get Canada, get Europe, get NATO, get South Korea, Japan. They both now have Space Force bases there. The U.S. does in those two countries, and they're expanding it even further throughout Asia as we go along. So I think that's the real agenda, number one, to get others to help pay for it. And then they'll bring them in, they'll give them a little bit of, some contracts, to work on some parts of it, that kind of thing, to keep their country locked in on it, because of jobs and all that stuff. But in the end, guess what? They set up the system, and it looks like this. Integrated system. They call it interoperability. So Japan or Korea or, Canada or England, they'll be part of this interoperable system. But the U.S. will be in charge of the tip of the spear. And no one will be allowed to use the spear except the United States. The United States will pick the day, the time, the hour, and the enemy, when it's used, how it's used. And the other countries, they're just servants. They're just agents working for the United States. That's the way it's all going to stack up in the end.
Could we add then, to get your thoughts, because you mentioned them using the funds to buy media, these space technologies. Something I talk a lot about on the podcast is the technocracy, the sort of global social credit system that's being built, this algocracy, ruled by algorithm, ruled by AI, where we're seeing this across the planet. I've been debanked from PayPal by the Department of Homeland Security for thought crime. And just yesterday, a French dissident was debanked. I forget his name. It's on my X account. He was debanked by the European Union for speaking against Frau Ursula Gertrud von der Leyen's criminality. And so do you think another aspect to what we're talking about here is how space, I guess, the surveillance, right? Because they've got the satellites that can record in high resolution. They can be recording everything. I mean, plus the drones, and then they can go back in time and at 2:33 p.m. zoom into your backyard or front yard and see what you were doing. And so the surveillance aspect as well. Just any comments on how space is used for that?
Well, let me start answering that very good question with this little bit of history. I don't think the Nazis were defeated in World War II. We know that under Operation Paperclip at the end of World War II, 1,500 Nazis were brought to the U.S., including Wernher von Braun, to create the U.S. space program, along with 100 copies of the V-2 rocket, brought to Huntsville, Alabama. Today, they call it the Pentagon of the South. And he had about 100 of his engineers and scientists, space guys that he brought with him. Well, who were the other 1,400 Nazis? What did they do? They were brought to help create the CIA. They were brought into flight medicine programs of the Air Force in Ohio at a base there, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The entire military-industrial complex was flooded with Nazis. MK Ultra, the mind control experiments that the Nazis were doing to prisoners during World War II at Auschwitz and other the death camps. All these programs were involved with the Nazis. And even the U.S. black budget apparently was a Nazi program that was integrated into the United States military. This top secret budget where even the Congress is not allowed to know how much money is spent, what it's spent on, anything like that. So I think that we have a global military operation now. And you talk about van der Leyen at the EU. I mean, she's obviously a part of it. Her father or grandfather, I forgot which now, was a Nazi. Many of the people in Canada and Ukraine, of course, are former Nazis. So, there's a real strong Nazi operation going on around the world that is totally linked into the U.S. and its allies today. So I think their goal is global domination. Their goal is to dominate the heavens as they can move off for mining, as I've already mentioned. And so I think things like AI and this whole data control, with banking and everything else, it's frightening. And I think that's where it's coming. They're going to be able to turn us off in a second. And it's likely, I saw Gates say that in 10 years, we're not going to need teachers and doctors anymore because of AI, So what we've got here on the planet now are superfluous populations by the hundreds of millions. And what are they going to do? Share the wealth with us? No way. It's impossible. So they got to get rid of us. And so one way of doing genocide is, as we see in Gaza today, just kill people, right on national television, if you will. But another way is to lower the caloric intake of people around the world by cutting social programs, cutting jobs, taking away their ability to access their bank account and buy food for their families. And slowly over time, they become homeless. They die at a younger age. People are losing their health care increasingly because of cost and cutbacks in programs at various countries. So I think that's the agenda. Get rid of the superfluous populations, have limited people, have robots and AI to do the work of the many. and just have this small class of rich people who are now in control of the planet. I think that's where they're going.
I think you're spot on. Our last guest, we discussed the technocratic dark state, and he covers some of what you brought up. And again, just yesterday, today, the news in the US, companies across the board cutting thousands, hundreds, thousands, and tens of thousands of jobs. And there was an important piece from the Pentagon Times, which I call the New York Times, the Pentagon Times. But nonetheless, it was actually one of the few times they published something that was valid and interesting about Amazon looking to automate 75% of their workforce or more. And they projected that given Amazon's growth, by 2033, they would need to hire from now until then 600,000 human workers. And as you're alluding to, how many people, that 600,000 people could support themselves plus the families that they would support, right? And that Bezos's goal is to those 600,000 jobs that they are going to need use robots so that they don't need to hire 600,000 people. And it's kind of like, well, there you go. And everything you outline, it's like this is slow genocide. And once people fall into poverty, as you said, malnutrition will lead to getting sick quicker and dying, all sorts of addictions, drugs, drinking, you name it, which again, we saw what happened to Russia in the 90s. Millions of people died just from the collapse of the economy.
If you think about it, Gaza today is the way to normalize genocide. And that's what it's being used for, I think, fundamentally. Obviously, also as part of this plan for Greater Israel, they want to take over all of Palestine. They want to take Lebanon. They want to take Syria. They want to take parts of Egypt, So, but it's about normalizing genocide, just getting us used to the idea. There's nothing you can do about it. Stay quiet, otherwise they'll take your bank, shut down your bank account, right?
It's almost like, I haven't seen the movie, but some of these dystopian TV shows like Squid Game, where they make a Running Man, where they make people participate in these reality shows where they kill them. And it's kind of almost like you say, it's kind of normalizing what's happening there. And some people have said that Gaza is the laboratory for these space technologies, which will then later be through Alex Karp's Palantir, Anduril, and all these different other companies, will be applied to the rest of the world. Because again, it's AI, it's related to the space technologies and lasers and missile systems and guidance systems and the AI kill list, Lavender, and all that. And so, yeah, it seems some have said that Gaza is going to be writ global, and we're being desensitized to that. No one's doing anything. Any further thought on that? And then I wanted to ask you about just your further thoughts. I see you guys have commented on Elon Musk and SpaceX and Starlink and the debris, some of the problems that's causing.
Yeah. One thing I would like to mention, Netflix has a new show out, new movie called House of Dynamite. I don't know if you've heard about it, but it's about a attack on the United States, some unnamed country, but they kind of make it sound like it's North Korea, launches one missile at the United States. They try to shoot it with a bullet hitting a bullet, their GBI system, ground-based interceptors stationed at Fort Greely in Alaska. And so the whole show is about the internal working of the decision-making, the identification of what's happening, who's going to get hit, when is it, all that stuff, all the way to the president, Secretary of Defense, the whole schmear. And it's all about that. And it's fascinating. And it's really a gripping film. I would urge anybody listening to, if you're on Netflix, House of Dynamite, check it out. And it really, at one point, when the interceptors don't work, don't hit this incoming one missile. I think it was the Secretary of Defense said, what? We spent $50 billion on these things and they don't even work, So, it's the right question, so to speak.
I haven't heard of it. I'll check that out. But and thoughts on Musk, and we haven't touched on the all the satellites that go up, the debris from them. Unfortunately, I have a Starlink because my internet goes out from time to time, and I activate it. But just thoughts on Elon Musk and SpaceX and Starlink, and I think it's quite obvious that he's. I question how self-made most of these guys are. They just seem to be, sort of, hey, we're going to give you these contracts. You're going to be sort of our Tony Stark, Iron Man, front man, who's going to make all this stuff cool.
Well, it's. I think you're right. Musk is a front man. He's a front man for mining Mars, for example. He wants to create a civilization, move our civilization to Mars. The Mars Society says the Earth is a rotting, dying, stinking planet, and we have to move to Mars to save civilization. But again, it's not about that at all. It's all about mining. And so Mars is the front man. I mean, Musk is the front man for this whole mining thing on Mars. So in Texas, every time they launch, it seems like, probably not every time, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but damn near every time they launch, they blow up their rockets and they create massive, massive debris all the way into Mexico. And the waters of the Gulf are becoming increasingly contaminated with the toxicity and the debris. And the place Boca Chica in Texas, where Musk launches from, has become, there's a animal refuge there with various endangered species living there, and all this debris falls down on top of them. It's become a terrible situation. Indigenous people, this is a sacred land to them, and they've been organizing and complaining and fighting against these launches by Musk. So it's a bad situation. But oftentimes with these launches, we're told that satellites are being launched in order to go up and study the ozone, which is, protects us from the rays of the sun. But as it turns out, every time you do one of these rocket launches, the exhaust rises, this toxic exhaust rises into the upper atmosphere and is punching a greater hole in the ozone layer. So the very lie that we're told that these, things are just going up to study, various ozone problems and stuff like that are exacerbating the problem. And now they're launching smaller and smaller satellites because they're worried about war in space. Because when I was talking about lower Earth orbit before, trying to keep Russia and China out of there, fill it up before they get there, they're worried that some of the bigger satellites are going to be hit, create more space debris. You have a cascading Kessler syndrome that soon makes lower Earth orbit like a minefield, and we won't be able to get anything off the planet Earth because of that. So they're creating these smaller satellites, but because of that, they're smaller, they have less fuel on them, and they can't stay up there so long. So they fall back to Earth. Musk's small Starlink satellites are falling back to Earth and burning up on reentry, which they say is a good thing. This way they don't fall and hit anybody in the head when they hit the planet. But what they don't tell you is these things, of course, are nothing but a series of toxic chemicals put into a satellite, wires and resistors and all kinds of electronic particles and everything else. When they burn up, this stuff turns to dust, and it is spread by the winds across the planet, which toxifies our Earth. So everything about this program is a mess from the start to the finish. And at the same time, they want to nuclearize it. They want to have nuclear rockets that'll cut in half the amount of time it takes to get to Mars. These rovers driving around Mars today are powered by plutonium-238. In 1997, I organized an international campaign against the launch of Cassini, an outer space probe by NASA, with 72 pounds of plutonium on board. And in their NASA's environmental impact statement, they said that if there was a launch explosion and a release of this plutonium as dust, it would be carried by the winds for 60-mile radius out to Disney World, north to Daytona Beach, south to Vero Beach, and they'd have to go in and remove all the people, have to go in and remove all the buildings, go in and remove all the vegetation, remove all the animals, the snakes, the alligators, the birds, the fish, you name it. And then they'd have to go in and remove the top half-inch of soil because everything would be radioactive for thousands of years. Now, do we really believe that these people could or would do that? No, it would become a nuclear wasteland. Florida would become a nuclear wasteland. Right before the launch of Cassini, at Los Alamos Labs in New Mexico, where they were fabricating these plutonium generators for that mission, they had 244 cases of worker contamination. So this idea of nuclearizing space is problematic even before you launch because of the deadly Department of Energy record of contamination of workers, air, water, and everything else. So the whole space thing is just dying for public attention.
And just what you mentioned on the Kessler syndrome, I think that's what it's called. Is that kind of like a double-edged sword where it could be a good thing in the sense where, so if some collision happens and it, what do you call it, cascades, has the ripple effect and then knocks out other satellites, does that mean then what you were mentioning earlier, the on-ramp, off-ramp, gravity well types of situation, if that happens, would that mean that no one would be able then to have space dominance?
Basically, I think you're right. I organized a protest in the late 80s at the Space Center. And Apollo astronaut Edgar Mitchell, one of the moonwalkers, came and spoke. The only time a former astronaut has ever spoke at one of our protests. And he talked about war in space. He said, if there's a war in space, it will be the one and only, because we'll create so much space debris, we won't be able to get a rocket through this minefield, he said. We will be entombed to the planet forever. There's no way of cleaning it up. So that's pretty strong words coming from an Apollo astronaut.
To get your thoughts, I subscribe to your newsletter, and sometimes I bookmark things for later viewing and tend to binge on different podcasts or channels. And you had a talk, I think, last month with the annual meeting with KJ No and Dave Webb, and I haven't been able to watch it yet, but I plan to. To get your thoughts, something I've been warning about for years, NATO. I've got it's right up above me. I got that from the Raoul Pal Institute and NATO terrorism sticker. And look, I'm an American citizen. I'm a European citizen. But as you mentioned EU earlier, I refer to it as the Fourth Reich. There's a book from a German doctor called The Nazi Roots of Brussels. It's a free book people can download to get his PDF. I forget, Dr. Roth. I can't remember his last name. I also call it the New European Soviet. Vladimir Bukovsky's Soviet dissident compared it to the New European to the Soviet. But my point is, NATO, I view as one of the principal globalist organizations, and it doesn't have a reason for existing, but now it's moving into Latin America. They've got Colombia and Argentina as global partners. And General Stavridis, in a Bloomberg op-ed last year, I believe, he said, we should just take Asian countries, I forget which ones, I don't know, Singapore, Thailand, and just add them to NATO. And now they're talking about, South Korea, Japan, Philippines. They're saying we should station, American nukes in these countries. And then, so effectively, they're trying to create this global NATO one world police military force, which would neatly fit with what you're talking about, the global Star Wars initiative. And so just thoughts on that, NATO, its expansion project, how they're trying to bring in some of their Asian allies to, I think, deal with the final outliers, which seem to be, like China and Russia and Iran and Venezuela.
And North Korea and others. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I see NATO expansion as a replacement of the UN. They can't completely control the United Nations. Security Council vetoes, things like that. Russia and China have power there. So the U.S. and the EU have a lot of control of the UN. I mean, let's face it, Annalena Baerbock's now the president of the General Assembly. I mean, what does that tell you about the power of the U.S. and the EU at the UN? But they still see it as problematic in the long run, especially with the rise of BRICS and the Global South and the African nations, demanding more power in the UN. They got to get out of there. And so they see NATO expansion as a way to create, quote unquote, an international, a global organization, democratic organization that doesn't need anybody's permission to go around kicking any country's ass whenever they want to. And that's, I think, where they're heading. That's NATO's job, is to just be a fascist police presence around the world. I've been paying some attention to the leadership in the EU and the people that get elected in these, like in Romania and Moldova, where they say, you can't run, you committed a crime that you've never been convicted of, and you can't run, so you're out in this upcoming election. So the person that the EU and the US wants wins every time. So I've been looking at the backgrounds of some of these people, and a lot of them ended up going to school at Yale University, Harvard University, the big Ivy League schools, where they're often recruited by the CIA. Now in Georgia, you remember, what was his name?
Saakashvili.
Yeah, Saakashvili, he ate his tie on television. He was so nervous one day. Well, he was the perfect example of one of these CIA plants inside of Georgia. And I think this is what they're doing whenever they move into these countries with NATO. They plant these CIA operatives inside of these countries. And so they ensure their control. Again, I go back to the Nazis, in World War II. They were not defeated. This is their game today. They're running these operations all over the world.
I wrote my master's thesis for the Geneva School of Diplomacy, where I studied on color revolutions, and I looked at the Rose Revolution, Saakashvili, the Ukraine Orange Revolution in the early 2000s, and then because I had lived in Mongolia as a Peace Corps volunteer, I had tried to see if I can. Yeah, everyone has been written about the color revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine and all these other countries, but few have paid attention to places like Mongolia. And it was, for me, shocking to discover at the time. You mentioned Saakashvili. He had been given financing, I think, by like USAID, Open Society, Soros, and he was given money, I think, from Open Society to create his own Liberty Institute, I think on the lead up to him becoming president, right? And then I found, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Mongolia was a satellite state. But at the time, this young Mongolian named Elbegdorj, who became president, I think in 2008 of Mongolia, way back in the 90s, USAID, Open Society, supported Elbegdorj, and he created also a Liberty Institute. So it's fun. It's like the same formula, like literally Liberty Institute in Mongolia, Liberty Institute in Georgia. But anyways, I did want to ask you, and just to add to what you were saying, I fully agree. I think it's important what you said, that NATO could be a replacement, sort of effectively world government, which I think that's what they're going for. And in my research about a year ago, I mean, I found articles from one of the big think tanks, Brookings or whatever, these globalist think tanks, and they were positing Mexico should become part of NATO. And to your point, they're saying, well, it doesn't make sense anymore. North Atlantic, the geography. And there was an article just a few years back, maybe 2 or 3, saying we should rename NATO to the New Alliance Treaty Organization. So there you go, to have this now global sort of government. And then maybe, I guess, to ask you just, if they push forward with this, the specter of World War III with China and Russia, and any thoughts on how we're doing there?
Well, I think we're all dead at that point if they go that far. Russia has said repeatedly, China has said repeatedly that we don't want war. We don't want to ever launch a first strike against the United States. In fact, they've been going to the UN for the last 30 years, every year, introducing a treaty to ban all weapons in space. PAROS, P-A-R-O-S, Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space. It passes overwhelmingly at the General Assembly as a resolution, with US and Israel voting no. But it's just a resolution. They send it to the Permanent Conference on Disarmament in Geneva for negotiation as a treaty. And there the US and Israel block it through Republican and Democrat administrations. So it's very clear that the U.S. wants war, and it wants to have as much military and as much space technology as they can to try to win these wars. But Russia and China have said, we're not going to let you control space and dominate space and use space against us. If you don't want to have a treaty, then I'm sorry, but we're going to outplay you. And that's what they're doing now. The U.S. is a collapsing empire. God knows how much longer it can continue with the many contradictions it has. Let's hope it collapses soon, because if it tries to go to full war with Russia and China and Iran and North Korea and anyone else like that, then Russia and China are going to respond, and they're going to hit us back as hard as we can. That's why I think that movie on Netflix, House of Dynamite, is really important for people to watch, because it really shows how screwed up the U.S. is internally within their whole military apparatus, where they have to make decisions in just a matter of moments about what to do in this moment where a nuclear war begins. It's very instructive. So we shouldn't have the slightest bit of confidence in the United States, in NATO, when it comes that they're, telling us they're going to protect us, they're going to look out for us. No. They are the aggressors, and they're not very smart. They're arrogant, they're crazy, and like Hitler, they think they can win when in fact they can't.
We just had a few days ago, I believe the Kremlin reportedly unveiled its latest nuclear missile called, known by NATO as Skyfall, which I think it went for 15 hours or something like that. And, I had on twice on the podcast before he passed, Johan Galtung. He passed a couple of years back, and he would always say, I love the American Republic, but not the American empire. And I think that's a strong point where, people who might misunderstand your statements or mine, that, we like the Constitution, the Republic, not this thing, which is the empire that's this colossus going around the planet. And I'm sure, I've got, there's a Nexus network of anonymous accounts on X that I call them Pentagon active measures. So when I have guests on, such as yourself or others, they'll interpret as pro-Russian or lefties or communists, and they come out and basically attack me for being like a Russian agent or something, when it's clear that these are Pentagon active measures, because all they never talk about the globalism or the empire. They play up NATO and EU, which are globalist institutions, and they are attacking Russia and China and saying, let's go to war with Russia and China. And they're positing that these plans for global domination are their origin is from Beijing and Moscow, like they're living in the 1950s. And you might disagree, but in many ways, I view Russia and China at this point as weaker than the West, because I think the Pax Americana has the upper hand in many ways when it comes to its global presence of information warfare. Putin admitted to that, and military strength for now. And so I find it a stretch to imagine that it's the East that's behind all of these plans for global domination. But anyways, is there anything else that I haven't asked that you think is important to get across, or any final thoughts?
Well, just riffing off your last point here, as a person that lives in the United States, born here, but traveled all over the world in my years in the work I do, I believe in democracy. I believe in the idea of democracy, but we don't have democracy anymore. All of the democratic institutions in this country are either gone or on their way out the door now. And what we have is full oligarch control of the United States of America. And they are draining the swamp. They're draining the public sector of every dollar they can. And it's like pirates grabbing the buried treasure under the sand. And that's the way I see these people. They are indeed pirates. And America's foreign policy is piracy. So as a person, I consider myself a patriotic American. It's my duty, I believe, to use every ounce of energy I have to try to fight this empire gone wild and to stop it in every way I can. Thank you very much for having me on.
And that's a great, I think as well, solution. People ask me, they leave comments, what can we do? It's like, look, I'm doing what I can where I am. Bruce is doing what he can with his energy in different ways. And people just need to educate themselves and just keep speaking truth to power. Your links are in the description, but where are the best places to find you? The projects you have, is there support that's needed?
Yeah. Well, you got our website, space4peace.org, and also my blog. It's my spiritual practice. I blog every day since 2005. It's called Organizing Notes, Notes, Organizing Notes, and I'm sure you can find it and put a link to it in there. That would be great. And if you want to keep up with what I'm doing, and I don't just work on space. I'm very much involved in the Palestine issue and other domestic issues. So if you want to follow my work, Organizing Notes is the best way.
All right, I will